Hey everyone, this is Pete. London Racer. That was fun, wasn't it? I actually ended up enjoying that silly old game a lot more than I expected to. Enough to make me want to explore what other janky delights Davilex had in store for me. Turns out there's a fair few of them, scattered across the PC, PlayStation and PlayStation 2 platforms. Some of them remained exclusive to certain regions, some of them got renamed to other things for international release, and some of them are much easier to get hold of than others. The next one we're going to take a look at is Europe Racer, which appears to be the next PlayStation-based entry in the series that showed up after London Racer. Technically, it's the follow-up to Paris-Marseille Racing from the year 2000, but that only released in France on PC. While the PlayStation entries in the Davilex Racer series are easy to play via emulation or original hardware today, the outdated DRM used on the PC titles makes them unplayable on anything beyond Windows Vista, so we'll be sticking to the console games. First impressions of Europe Racer are surprisingly good. The intro sets up the racers in the game as actual characters rather than anonymous opponents, and this time around there's a narrative setup of sorts. Not much of one admittedly, but an effort was made at least.
My name is Caesar. My friend Ruby and I organize illegal motor races. We choose only the very best racing drivers to take part. Drivers with talent. Drivers with guts. Drivers like you.
Once the main menu comes up, things continue to look pretty promising. Rather than dumping you straight into a linear series of races with no real control over what you're doing, Europe Racer instead offers a variety of ways to play. The single race mode allows you to play a one-off event in several styles. Either a straightforward race against 3 opponents, not the 6 the menu promises, presumably that was a holdover from the PC version, a time trial on a single track, or an elimination race against 3 opponents, where whoever is in last place is disqualified at the end of each lap. The Championship mode, meanwhile, offers a series of themed championships that task you with completing a short series of races as your selected character. Between races, you can spend money to repair your vehicle, top up its nitro boost, or make a couple of upgrades to your car. Finally, the Adventure mode offers an experience similar to the original London Racer. Playing as a single character, you race through all the courses in the game one at a time, attempting to come out on top of the Grand Championship. Since all the modes aside from the time trials and elimination races in Europe Racer play pretty much identically, let's do a run through the Adventure mode, see what this game has to offer, and determine if it still has the same rough and ready charm that made London Racer so oddly appealing. You begin by picking a character, which also determines which country's team you represent. Each character has access to 3 different cars, but there's no particularly noticeable differences between them other than visuals. You can actually pick which of your character's 3 cars you want to use before each race, but since the sports car is so obviously better than the other 2, there's little reason to choose anything else. For our first race, we're off to Rome, and as soon as the race starts you will likely notice a few things. God, this game is ugly, and dear lord, my car handles like a shopping trolley. Let's address those points up front, because honestly after you've been playing Europe Racer for a little while you stop noticing both of them, or at the very least you get used to them. The visuals are noticeably uglier than London Racer for a few reasons. Firstly, the textures appear to be much lower resolution than its predecessor, making the whole game look considerably less detailed overall. Not that London Racer was ever really approaching photorealistic status even by PlayStation standards, but Europe Racer's texture work is noticeably rougher. Secondly, the pop-up is much more evident than in London Racer. The draw distance is quite a bit less, meaning that on long straightaways it often just looks like you're driving into the void until a building pops up out of nowhere. And this feeling is only compounded by the lack of skyboxes this time around. In the distance is nothing but gradient colours and a sense of vague disappointment. This is a shame, as it means when the few vaguely impressive landmarks do appear, you don't have a lot of time to appreciate them, because by the time they've popped out of the parallel dimension beyond the clipping plane, you're already pretty much on top of them. Thirdly, the car models are just awful. I have no defence for them, they're just dreadful, which again is a notable step back from London Racer. The cars there were certainly not a patch on the most impressive PlayStation races like Gran Turismo and Ridge Racer Type 4, but most of them were at least recognisable as the cars they were supposed to be based on. As for the handling, it's worth noting that the game does support analog control. If you have a DualShock or PlayStation analog controller, it's well worth using, as it makes the car control much more manageable. The game is playable with the digital D-pad, but it's not implemented as well as in London Racer. The cars have a tendency to oversteer considerably with digital controls, requiring something of a gentle touch. That said, the handling model itself is a tad simpler than London Racer also. While some tracks in London Racer required that you actually slow down for tight corners, in most cases in Europe Racer you can keep your foot to the floor for the whole track, and unlike the previous game, continual oversteering doesn't result in a perilous skid. This takes a bit of getting used to, but it's actually quite fun once you get a feel for it. Outside of the more questionable aspects, one thing you will notice immediately about Europe Racer is that there are floating collectibles all over the track. These include fuel for your nitro, wrenches to repair damage to your vehicle, money, and occasional one-shot power-ups that make you invincible or temporarily freeze all your opponents. Collecting each of these is accompanied by a sound effect that appears to have been sampled from a 1980s pub fruit machine, making them really fun to grab. You may also notice that the police are not really an issue in Europe Racer, unlike London Racer. They're there, supposedly. You'll occasionally hear their sirens and megaphones telling you to pull over, but in an entire run through adventure mode on the hardest difficulty, the footage from which you're watching right now, I didn't actually see a police car once, let alone get caught by one. It has to be said that your opponents aren't really much of an issue either, even on the hardest difficulty. They have a tendency to get stuck on certain parts of the stage and pootle around like old ladies the rest of the time. While Europe Racer does feature some of the same rubber banding as seen in London Racer, meaning that if you make a mistake an opponent will often come screaming straight past you, it's generally pretty easy to get out in front and stay there. After Rome, it's on to Amsterdam, and here we start seeing some of the ways in which Europe Racer distinguishes itself from its predecessor. The big selling point for Europe Racer, and the reason why, despite all its ugliness and weird issues, I still think it's worth playing, is that its course design is mostly interesting and ambitious. The way the Amsterdam course races along the canals is picturesque and enjoyable, and it's also not used as a gimmick that lasts for the entire course. Instead, these sequences are complemented with sections where you race through more conventional city streets. The main criticism of this course is that when you first encounter it, it can sometimes be a little difficult to judge where you're supposed to go. Once you get a feel for it though, it's a fun experience that is markedly different from the sort of things you might experience in a more conventional racer. In some ways, it feels more like the sort of course you might see in a kart racer, and when you take into account the exaggerated handling and floating power-ups of Europe Racer, this comparison feels even more apt. All you're missing is something to throw at your opponents. Following Amsterdam, it's time to cross the channel and head to Oxford. This course will initially be familiar to London Racer veterans, though it also highlights a disparity in graphics between the two games as it looks markedly worse than its previous incarnation. Despite this, a rather pleasing thing to note about Europe Racer's courses is that in instances where settings from London Racer have been reused, the tracks tend to feature a blend of familiar and new sections. This means they provide some nice series fan service for those who enjoyed the original, while still offering a new challenge rather than simply being copy-pasted. Bonus points for that. The Oxford course also highlights the difference in handling between London Racer and Europe Racer. While London Racer's handling required that you brake heavily for the tight corners and narrow streets of Oxford, for the majority of your race around the historic city in Europe Racer, you can keep your foot down. The car's tendency to oversteer is very helpful for those 90-degree turns. Next up, it's off to Germany for a high-speed race around Berlin. The fairly wide roads of this course make for a fun ride, and it also highlights one of the places where Europe Racer actually takes a step forward beyond what London Racer offered: alternative routes. While London Racer featured a number of sections where it looked like it would be possible to take a different route or shortcut, they were all covered with invisible walls. Not so in Europe Racer. There are parts of several tracks where you have a choice of which way to go, and even a few unmarked shortcuts here and there. There are also some sections where driving on a specific part of the track, perhaps down the central reservation for example, can lead to more substantial bonuses than sticking to the road. Herein lies a bit of an issue though. After a certain point in Europe Racer, money becomes completely useless. There are only 3 upgrades to purchase, which apply to all 3 of your cars, and the only use for money after that is repairing your vehicle and topping up your nitro before the start of the next race. And you don't even really need to do that, since the repair and nitro pickups are so abundant on each and every course. This issue could have perhaps been alleviated somewhat if Europe Racer recorded high scores in terms of money collected on each course, but sadly it simply records best times and the best final championship result in adventure mode. It's a relatively minor issue in the grand scheme of things, but it shows that some of the balance and structural issues of London Racer are still present, albeit in a slightly different form. At least you don't get money thrown at you just for having a nice car this time around. After Berlin, we head to Spain for the Barcelona course. This is a fun track that is another good example of Europe Racer's imaginative course design, though there are a couple of instances where it can be tricky to judge where you're supposed to go, most notably towards the conclusion of each lap, where you have to turn off the main road onto a dirt track. Like Berlin, the city sections of this course also tend to offer a choice of routes, or at least wide streets where the way in which you position yourself can determine what bonuses you successfully acquire. There's a few jump ramps here and there too, which provide you access to some hard to reach cash bonuses, as well as highlighting the somewhat questionable physics model at play in Europe Racer. Next, it's back to England for a drive through the scenic British countryside. This is another one of the courses that will be familiar to London Racer veterans, as it's based on the Oxford to London course from the original game. But there are some key differences, most notably the fact that the grass verges can now be driven on, and the fact that the middle section of the course is an extremely wide, muddy off-road section that almost feels like you have to explore it to get the best out of it. There's also a fun bit of dynamic scenery. Hitting a jump later in the course just right causes a prefabricated construction site building to come crashing down onto the road, potentially getting in the way of your opponents. It would have been nice to see more stuff like this throughout Europe Racer. One slight disappointment, speaking as a British person, is the fact that the AI traffic is all driving on the wrong side of the road on this course. This is a bit of an oversight considering the urban UK courses in Europe Racer do correctly place AI traffic on the left hand side of the road. Although honestly here it's fairly likely you'll just find cars speeding down the middle of the road, so perhaps we're just dealing with maniacs. The next course is Vienna, where we're promised the site of the famous Wurstelprater Ferris wheel. It's invisible at the start line but pops out of the void within seconds of starting the race. This is a fun course that highlights what Europe Racer's graphics engine is actually a little better at, more enclosed tight spaces. This is most evident when racing down narrow, twisty city streets, and especially during a detour through a lush green park on this course. Had the whole game's courses been designed like this, the graphical shortcomings would have perhaps been a little less obvious. Sadly, the latter half of the course is all wide, straight roads that emphasise the short draw distance to a painful degree. It's all the more noticeable after the fun park sequence in particular. It's time to head for Gay Paris in the next course, with some scenery that will doubtless be familiar to Midtown Madness veterans. Interestingly, the area around the Arc de Triomphe is one of the few areas in the game where there's some noticeable slowdown, and it's not entirely clear why, particularly because it occurs while not actually looking at the arch itself. Several areas on the course feature quite wide open areas with a choice of routes or multiple roads going the same direction, giving a nice feeling of freedom in some sections. I feel it's probably also worth highlighting that my wife came in while I was recording the footage of this course and immediately asked, "Is that supposed to be Paris?" So I think we can take that as a sign that the visuals and design of this course are at least semi-convincing. Next up, we head for Madrid, where the game warns us of unsuspected bends and sudden tunnel entries.
Matron, take them away!
The course is actually a lot less dramatic than its description suggests, though the road towards the start of the course does feature lots of tunnel entrances and exits that act more as obstacles than anything else. There are, however, a few sequences where you can take alternative routes and find hidden bonuses, which is pretty fun. Otherwise, this is probably one of Europe Racer's less interesting courses. Good for uncomplicated speedy racing, but not particularly fun for sightseeing. On to Stockholm for the next race, where the game warns that it might start to rain. Spoiler, it doesn't. I don't know if it does in the PC version, but it certainly doesn't in the PlayStation version. The grey sky and more muted colour palette does at least make for a different mood though. This is another nice course that actually plays to Europe Racer's strengths. The overall design of the course makes the short draw distance and pop-up less obvious, and the split level road later in each lap is a nice example of how it's possible to take alternative routes. It gives a much stronger feeling of these circuits being situated in actual cities, rather than simply being theme park-esque recreations. We're about 2/3 of the way through the game now, and it's finally time to return to London. Unfortunately, in contrast to the Stockholm course, this track really is where Europe Racer's weakness in the graphics department compared to London Racer is readily apparent. The brown void in the middle distance, the Houses of Parliament popping up out of nowhere. It really is not a patch on the original. However, it is nice to see that, like the other courses returning from London Racer, there are some differences from the original track. Areas that were blocked off in London Racer can now be driven through, once again giving a greater feeling of freedom. It's just a shame we can't have it both ways, the slightly nicer graphics and the more interesting course design. You may also notice somewhat erratic behaviour of the damage meter in this footage, a bug that seemingly becomes more prevalent the longer you play. Sometimes it will drop below zero, sometimes it will show inaccurate values, sometimes picking up collectibles that are nothing to do with repairing your car will change what the damage meter says. It never caused a significant enough issue to break gameplay, but it is quite amusing to see. Pressing onwards, we make it to Marseille, the second title track of Europe Racer's France-only predecessor. This is another track that works nicely within the limitations of Europe Racer's graphics engine, and it's a fun, well-designed course too. It's particularly nice that there are some almost secret areas to explore in this one, such as the car park you can drive into, then leap out of to return to the road. Oh, if you were wondering about the repetitive nature of the music you're hearing in the background, that's because there's only a few Redbook audio CD tracks that provide the soundtrack to Europe Racer. Each time you start a race, one of these is picked at random, and with the small number of tracks, it's quite likely you'll hear the same song in succession quite a few times. Not a huge issue, but it would have perhaps been nice for there to at least be enough music for one unique track per course. We're approaching the finish line as we head to Athens, another well-designed course with some interesting elements and multiple routes. The particular highlight of this course is the section where you race through the ruins, picking your own route around the rubble rather than following a clearly defined track. The city street sections also feature a greater than average number of forks in the road, allowing you to take one of two routes to the same destination. This gives Athens the feeling of being one of the more replayable tracks, though in most cases the different routes take pretty much the same amount of time to meet up again. It's then onwards to Florence for the penultimate track. This is another track with some alternative routes to take, but it's tricky for all the wrong reasons. At more than one point in the course it is very difficult to see where you're actually supposed to be going. Thankfully, the pitiful performance of the AI racers mean that even getting completely turned around won't be a problem for you for long. And I'll remind you that there are supposed to be police chases in this game, yet we still haven't seen any sign of them. This is hard difficulty, by the way. Indeed, for the final race in London Park, I decided to give the AI racers a 5-second head start, which they took advantage of by what I can only describe as trundling away slowly while I waited for them to build up a lead which I promptly took back within a couple of seconds. Not exactly what I call challenging, or indeed hard. As a finale to the adventure mode, London Park is unfortunately a little underwhelming. Covering some of the same areas the Park and Palace course in London Racer, the shortcomings of Europe Racer's visuals are once again very apparent. Not only that, but it's not a particularly challenging, interesting course either. There are a couple of nice landmarks along the way, such as Buckingham Palace, but for the most part it's fairly nondescript city streets that just don't quite feel like they have as much personality as in London Racer. And your reward after that? A couple of lines of text. Not even a stock image of a trophy with a misspelled congratulatory message this time, just a couple of lines of text. No end sequence, no acknowledgement of the narrative setup, nothing. But again, like with London Racer, I can't bring myself to be upset with Europe Racer. In fact, I'll tell you something. I actually played through the adventure mode twice, because first time I recorded footage for some reason I had no sound. Rather than dreading having to spend another hour of my life playing through the game, I actually welcomed the opportunity to revisit it, even with all its myriad flaws and ugly visuals. Why? because it's fun. I can't deny that. I can't deny that Europe Racer has some sort of magic ingredient that just makes it enjoyable to play. A factor that keeps you engaged with it even as you're painfully aware of its balance issues, shonky graphics, repetitive music and atrocious car models. And at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. Sure, like its predecessor, it doesn't hold a candle to the big budget, well-crafted races on PlayStation, but that doesn't mean it's not worth playing at all. In fact, this is the sort of game that long after the original PlayStation was current, I actually prefer looking back on, because I played all the good games to death back in the day. Europe Racer, meanwhile, was a completely new one on me, and I can't say I'm sorry I decided to check it out. While I completely appreciate there are probably more off-putting aspects of this game than its predecessor London Racer, I'd still encourage you to give it a go for yourself if you have the opportunity, because it certainly has a distinct charm to it. And if nothing else, after the rigid structure of London Racer, it's nice to see Davilex clearly trying their absolute best to provide a more comprehensive game experience this time around, with its multiple ways to play. From here on, we're into the PS2 era of the Davilex Racer series, so I'm very interested to see what's next. In the meantime though, both London Racer and Europe Racer are PS1 titles that I can see myself returning to occasionally. There's something simply very likeable about both of them, and I feel it's a bit of a shame I missed out on them back in the day.